Did you know that in late 2025, Canada made a statement about Filipinos so shocking that global agencies demanded an emergency briefing within hours? A revelation so unexpected that it changed how world powers view migrant workers and exposed a truth governments never wanted the public to see. Today, we uncover what Canada just admitted about Filipinos, why major nations are now scrambling, and how this single announcement could reshape the future of migration forever. Stay with me, this affects everyone. If you're interested in this topic, hit the join button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. The year was 2025, and the air in Ottawa felt heavier than usual. Inside the glass-walled headquarters of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, officials were pacing, whispering, double-checking documents as if preparing for a global announcement that could shift international relationships overnight. At exactly 9:14 a.m., the briefing room doors opened, and Director Evelyn Ward, a woman known for her precision, her neutrality, and her refusal to sugarcoat reality, stepped onto the stage with a solemn expression. Cameras flashed, diplomatic representatives tightened their posture, and millions watched the live broadcast, not knowing that Canada was about to reveal something that would rewrite how Filipinos are viewed across the world. For years, Filipinos were known as essential workers, nurses, caregivers, builders, innovators. But what Ward revealed went far beyond economic contribution. "We have conducted a decade-long internal assessment," she began, her voice steady, "and we have concluded something unprecedented. The Filipino workforce has become the backbone of Canada's operational stability in ways no other nationality has achieved." The room froze. Reporters glanced at each other, unsure if they heard correctly. No government had ever said something this bold, and Ward wasn't finished. If Filipino migration were to decline significantly, even by a small margin, several of our most critical systems would face immediate destabilization. Healthcare, infrastructure, long-term elder care, emergency response, rural service continuity. These sectors are not just supported by Filipinos, they are sustained by them. A murmur rippled through the audience. And if you're watching this right now, I need you to really grasp what she meant, because statements like this don't come from nowhere. They come from data, crisis projections, and internal warnings that nations never share publicly unless they have no choice. Ward then revealed a classified report labeled Operational Risk Forecast 2026-2034. In it, Canada admitted something shocking. Without Filipino workers, the country would face a nationwide care deficit within 3 years. Hospitals would experience critical staffing shortages. Elderly citizens would have no one to assist them. Certain municipalities would struggle to maintain basic daily operations. You know what's even more chilling? Canada didn't call this a future threat. They called it an active vulnerability. And if you're listening, this should make you realize something important. The world depends on Filipinos far more than Filipinos realize. But here's where the twist came, and why this story becomes a wake-up call for every Filipino worldwide. Canada admitted that they ignored early warnings for years because they believed Filipino workers would always be available, always adapt, always endure the system. In other words, they relied on Filipino resilience instead of fixing structural problems. And maybe as you're hearing this, you're suddenly realizing how true that is globally. Countries lean on Filipino sacrifice like it's guaranteed. But what happens when Filipinos finally demand better? What happens when they stop accepting unfair treatment? What happens when they choose nations that respect them and walk away from those that don't? That's the fear Canada finally acknowledged. They underestimated the Filipino breaking point. And before I go deeper, I need to tell you something important, because it actually protects you. If you're the kind of person who wants to stay updated about global changes that could affect your opportunities, your family's future, and your safety abroad, then you need to subscribe now. Because if you miss the moment when a country shifts its policies even slightly, you could lose your chance to migrate, reunite with family, or take advantage of benefits that disappear overnight. Don't wait until doors close. Don't wait until opportunities dry up. Don't be the one commenting later saying, "I wish I knew sooner." If you refuse to subscribe, at least tell me why in the comments, so Canada and the world can hear how people feel about announcements like this. Now let's continue. Ward then detailed Canada's internal panic during the pandemic years. When borders closed and Filipino migration slowed temporarily, Canada ran emergency simulations. The results were devastating. Hospital units couldn't operate, senior care collapsed in multiple regions, and certain remote towns faced the threat of shutting down public services altogether. Think about that. A G7 country admitting it could not function without Filipino workers. But what came next was even more unbelievable. Canada revealed that Filipinos outperform every other migrant group in 4 major categories: crisis adaptability, workplace retention, long-term residency commitment, and cultural integration. In simple words, Filipinos don't just work well, they stabilize entire communities. Ward called Filipinos the world's most reliable workforce, a phrase that exploded across Canadian social media within minutes. But then she delivered the statement that sent shockwaves across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. If global competition for Filipino workers continues to rise, Canada risks losing its strongest pillar of economic resilience. Translation? Countries are now competing aggressively to attract Filipinos, and Canada is scared of losing them. That's why immigration policies suddenly shifted in the last months. That's why employers began raising wages. That's why provinces launched retention programs specifically targeting Filipino workers. You weren't imagining it. You weren't overvaluing yourself. The world really is chasing Filipino talent. And countries like Canada, they're terrified of falling behind. And listen, because this is another moment where I have to protect you. Governments release announcements strategically. They reveal just enough to calm the public, but they never reveal the full reality unless you're paying attention. If you want to make sure you're one step ahead of immigration changes, job openings, recruitment warnings, and opportunities before they close, then subscribe now. Not because I told you to, but because the people who stay informed are the ones who get ahead. The ones who ignore updates, they're the first to get left behind, and I don't want that to be you or your family. If you still don't want to subscribe, comment below and explain why, because your opinion is part of the national conversation, and it matters. Now, as reporters continued questioning Ward, one journalist asked the question everyone was afraid to say out loud. "Why are you telling the world this now?" Ward sighed. "Because other countries have already begun forming strategies to attract Filipino workers, and we can no longer pretend Canada is automatically their first choice. We must earn their trust." Imagine that a powerful nation openly admitting it needs to earn Filipino loyalty. But the hardest truth came when Ward addressed discrimination. Filipinos, she said, face the highest levels of under-recognition despite being the most indispensable workforce in Canada. This contradiction can no longer continue. For decades, Filipinos saved lives, raised children, built businesses, staffed hospitals, and filled roles Canadians could not fill, yet the world barely talked about their impact. That ends now. Canada officially acknowledged what Filipinos already knew. They are essential not because they endure hardship, but because they elevate entire systems. And if the world wants Filipinos, they must start showing respect, not just reliance. And that is where part 2 will take us. The backlash, the policy shifts, and the global ripple effect of Canada's confession. But before we move on, here's the last thing I'll say. This story affects every Filipino on the planet. And missing updates like this could mean missing your chance to migrate, secure better work, or understand your worth in a changing world. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Don't wait for the consequences to hit before paying attention. And if you still refuse, comment why. Your voice might be the one Canada listens to next. The global tension that followed Canada's announcement didn't fade, it intensified. What started as a single public admission turned into a geopolitical chain reaction, and for the first time in modern history, Filipino workers became the center of a global tug-of-war. Countries that once acted as if Filipinos were just another migrant group suddenly behaved like they'd discovered a rare resource they could no longer live without. It wasn't flattery, it was fear, quiet, concealed, but unmistakable. That fear revealed itself in leaked diplomatic transcripts, where officials debated how deeply their industries would collapse if Filipinos shifted their loyalty. One European minister even said, "If Canada sets a new benchmark for Filipino treatment, we will lose them. Our healthcare system cannot survive even a 15% decline." 15%. That's all it would take to push an entire nation into crisis. This wasn't exaggeration, it was math. Behind the scenes, governments mobilized crisis teams to analyze Filipino workforce dependency. Some countries realized that over 60% of their caregivers were Filipino. Others had Filipino nurses running entire hospital wings. Middle Eastern construction firms quietly admitted that if Filipino supervisors left, work sites would stop instantly. No one else had their organizational discipline. Aviation companies found that Filipino aircraft technicians were the backbone of maintenance crews. Even the U.S. military, though silent, publicly released internal assessments concluding that their Pacific operations relied heavily on Filipino-American personnel, whose cultural resilience made them uniquely stable during prolonged missions. In short, Filipinos weren't just workers, they were infrastructure. Human infrastructure. And Canada exposed that truth to the world. While nations struggled to form diplomatic responses, Filipinos everywhere watched closely, eager to see how each country would react. What none of them expected was the wave of subtle retaliation that would follow. Some governments felt embarrassed, ashamed that another country admitted something they refused to say out loud. Others feared that Canada's honesty would spark a surge of Filipino migration toward Canada, leaving them short-staffed. Instead of improving conditions, they began considering tightening rules, restricting visas, and reducing opportunities. It wasn't about rejecting Filipinos, it was about preventing a mass migration that could devastate their labor markets. But all these silent moves created a dangerous situation for ordinary Filipinos abroad. Many OFWs didn't realize that while Canada was opening its doors wider, other countries were preparing to close theirs. And missing this information could cost someone their chance at a life-changing opportunity. This is exactly why staying updated matters. This is why subscribing is not optional. If you're Filipino and you're trying to build a future abroad, missing a single policy shift can cost you years, the kind of setback that keeps families apart or forces someone into debt all over again. I don't want you waking up one day commenting, "No one told me about this change." If you don't want to subscribe, that's your choice, but at least comment why. Every reason matters, and your comment helps push this information to more Filipinos who need it urgently. Meanwhile, the Philippines itself began observing the situation with growing interest. Economic planners at home realized something powerful. For the first time, Filipinos had leverage. Real leverage. Canada's statement changed the narrative from "Filipinos are seeking opportunity" to "countries are seeking Filipinos." That shift is monumental. When a workforce becomes in demand globally, wages go up, protections improve, visa options expand, and applicants gain bargaining power. But here's the twist the world didn't expect. Filipino workers began asking tougher questions during interviews. Some began comparing contracts from different countries and choosing the best, not the first offer. Some even refused positions that lacked clear protections. And employers, terrified of losing them, suddenly became very flexible. Behind closed doors, Canada understood this shift better than anyone. Their immigration ministry held an emergency meeting titled Filipino Workforce Stability, Risk Analysis. The meeting notes were never meant to leave the room, but insiders leaked them anyway. The documents admitted that if Filipinos shifted away from Canada, even temporarily, critical operations would collapse in hospitals, long-term care homes, logistics hubs, and food service sectors. The analysis ended with a chilling line. Filipinos are not just workers, they are structural pillars. Losing them is not an option. When that leak surfaced, other countries panicked even more. Meanwhile, employers began noticing an unusual pattern. Filipino workers were suddenly being treated with a level of respect they hadn't experienced before. Supervisors became more patient. HR departments became more attentive. Companies that once ignored complaints now acted immediately. This wasn't kindness. It was fear disguised as professionalism. Employers knew that one unhappy Filipino could convince 10 others to leave, and no company could afford that risk. Employers in Canada began offering incentives, upgraded housing, pathway to citizenship programs, even family reunification assistance. But employers in other countries, unwilling to raise salaries or improve conditions, quietly pushed for immigration restrictions to slow Filipino migration to Canada. This created a hidden race that Filipinos didn't even know they were part of a global competition to secure their loyalty. And if you're watching this, you need to understand. Whether you're an OFW, a student, a professional, or someone planning to migrate, this information shapes your future. If your goal is to build a stable life abroad, you cannot afford to be uninformed. I promise you. The people who subscribe, the people who stay updated, the people who know the system, that's who wins in situations like this. And the reason some Filipinos get left behind is because they hear about changes too late. If you refuse to subscribe, tell me in the comments why. Your hesitation will help thousands of others recognize what's holding them back. As global reactions continued, Canada revealed the second phase of their plan. They wanted to create a long-term Filipino integration strategy. Not a temporary band-aid, not a short-term recruitment goal, but a generational workforce partnership. The proposal included educational grants for Filipinos, expanded caregiver programs, faster work to residency pathways, and bilateral agreements with the Philippine government. Other countries saw this as a threat. If Canada made migration easier for Filipinos, other nations stood to lose their workers permanently. Nations like Italy, Spain, Israel, and Singapore began drafting counter-strategies, some offering new job benefits, others simplifying work visas. But some countries, unwilling to compete, began quietly shutting doors. Filipinos abroad started noticing strange changes. Application requirements increased. Processing times grew longer. Interview questions became tougher. Some countries began imposing stricter skill assessments or language tests. It wasn't discrimination, it was desperation. If they made entry harder, fewer Filipinos would leave their current jobs to chase opportunities in Canada. That's the part most Filipinos don't see. While Canada opens doors, others will close theirs. That's why being updated matters. That's why subscribing is protection. Missing this information could put you at the wrong place at the wrong time, trapped by policies you didn't see coming. But here's the plot twist. Canada's honesty created something no one predicted, a global reawakening of Filipino confidence. Workers who once saw themselves as just migrants suddenly realized they were global assets. They weren't the ones who were. Replaceable countries were replaceable. And for the first time, Filipinos started asking, which country deserves my work? That shift in mindset, quiet but powerful, sent ripples through the global economy. And the world felt it. OFWs became more selective. Students chose schools in countries with better migration pathways. Nurses preferred nations with clearer long-term residency options. Skilled workers targeted regions offering higher wages and stable futures. Canada benefited immediately. Their application numbers spiked. But other nations panicked and responded by reforming their systems not out of generosity, but survival. Yet, even with all this global chaos, the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Canada is preparing a new statement, one that analysts believe will be even bigger, even bolder, and far more disruptive than the last one. And if you're Filipino, this next announcement could affect your future in ways you don't expect. But that's exactly where the final chapter begins. What happened next wasn't supposed to leak, but it did, and once it reached the Filipino community, it changed everything. Canada's Ministry of Immigration had prepared a confidential document called the Stability Blueprint, a long-term strategy outlining how the country planned to restructure its workforce around one central pillar: Filipinos, not as temporary labor, not as short-term fixes, but as the backbone of Canada's future. The blueprint described Filipino workers as culturally resilient, professionally adaptive, socially cohesive, and strategically irreplaceable. 4 qualities that, when combined, made Filipinos the most valuable workforce demographic in the world. Canada wasn't just praising Filipinos, they were admitting dependency. But the real shock wasn't the praise, it was the fear hidden between the lines. The blueprint warned that if other countries made aggressive moves to win over Filipino workers, Canada would lose its competitive advantage within 3 years. 3 years. That was the number keeping Canadian officials awake at night. And what scared them even more was the possibility that Filipinos might suddenly decide to stop settling for the bare minimum and start demanding the respect they deserved everywhere, not just in Canada. But as this document quietly circulated among analysts, something strange started happening in countries that had remained silent until now. The United States began a covert policy review on Filipino visa categories. Australia ordered a workforce dependency audit. The United Kingdom launched an emergency task force to evaluate how many Filipino healthcare workers they needed over the next decade. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't timing. It was reaction. The world had spent decades benefiting from Filipino labor without acknowledging how essential it was. But the moment one country broke the silence, the rest realized they might lose the very workers holding their systems together. And that's when it began, the global competition for Filipinos. But as this silent race intensified, something even more important was happening among Filipinos themselves. A shift was taking place not externally, but internally. Filipinos around the world started recognizing their worth. They noticed how countries reacted. They heard the quiet panic. They saw opportunities expanding. And for the first time, they began to understand that they weren't the ones who were easily replaced countries were. That realization changed how Filipinos negotiated contracts, how they approached interviews, how they selected destinations, and how they viewed their own power. You could feel that shift everywhere on TikTok, Facebook groups, OFW forums, migration seminars, airport terminals. It was subtle but undeniable. And here's the truth, Jeff. People who stay informed benefit from these shifts. People who don't get left behind. That's why you cannot afford to miss updates. That's why subscribing isn't about supporting a channel, it's about protecting your future opportunities. And if you feel like subscribing is unnecessary, fine, comment why. Even your refusal becomes engagement that helps push this crucial information to another Filipino who might desperately need it. The algorithm responds to activity, not silence. And silence is the reason so many Filipinos miss life-changing updates. Meanwhile, Canada prepared the next phase of their announcement, a bold, unprecedented move designed to cement their position as the top destination for Filipinos. They weren't just planning to expand caregiver pathways or speed up residency approval. They were developing something far more transformational, a bilateral migration agreement between the Philippines and Canada. This wasn't a visa. This wasn't a temporary program. This was a generational pact that would allow Filipinos to migrate more easily, work with greater protection, access faster pathways to permanent residency, and bring their families sooner. But that wasn't the part that shocked analysts. The real surprise was that Canada wanted the Philippine government to co-manage the program, meaning they were willing to share power. And if you understand geopolitics, you know this never happens. But just as Canada was preparing to finalize the agreement, a wave of resistance erupted not from Filipinos, but from foreign governments terrified of losing Filipino workers. Some nations began drafting emergency incentives. Others accelerated immigration reforms. A few even tried restricting Filipino departures under the guise of market stability. But beneath every political statement, every economic analysis, every diplomatic whisper was the same fear. If Filipinos leave us for Canada, our systems will collapse. Filipinos didn't see this panic, but the signs were everywhere. Subtle changes in local job postings, sudden improvements in contract offerings, employers becoming unusually generous. The shift wasn't generosity, it was survival. Countries realized that the global workforce was entering a new phase, Filipino leverage, and the Philippines itself felt the tremors. Economists started asking whether OFWs would eventually return home in large numbers, bringing with them skills that could transform the Philippine economy. Politicians began proposing reintegration programs. Private sectors anticipated an influx of experienced professionals. Suddenly, the long-term narrative shifted. Filipinos were no longer seen as workers sent abroad. They were future global leaders capable of reshaping nations. But amid this massive global movement, something personal happened, a moment that cut through all the international noise. It came from a Filipino nurse in Toronto named Marianne. She shared her story online after reading Canada's statements. She wrote about how she once felt invisible, treated as if she were just another nurse from a foreign country. But after Canada publicly recognized the importance of Filipinos, she walked into her hospital with her head higher. Doctors greeted her respectfully. Patients thanked her more sincerely. Administrators involved her in decision-making. Nothing changed on paper, but everything changed in mindset. And she ended her post with a sentence that resonated with millions. For the first time, I feel like I belong in the country I am helping keep alive. Her message spread like wildfire. Filipinos everywhere began sharing similar stories, moments of recognition, moments of pride, moments of being seen. And that pride created something powerful: unity. Filipinos realized that across the world, from nurses in London, to caregivers in Milan, to engineers in Qatar, to students in Sydney, they weren't just scattered workers. They were a global force. And that force was finally being acknowledged. But with that recognition came a warning, a reminder that the global landscape can shift instantly. Opportunities open and opportunities close, and the ones who stay uninformed lose everything. That's why I'm telling you, if you don't subscribe, you won't know when the next shift hits. You won't know when the doors open or when they slam shut. If you want to risk that, comment why. Let other Filipinos read your reasoning. Maybe they'll see themselves in your hesitation and decide differently. But here's the twist that no one expected. Canada wasn't done. Their next announcement wasn't about Filipinos as workers, it was about Filipinos as partners. They revealed internal discussions about developing Filipino-led leadership programs, empowering Filipinos to take managerial, supervisory, and administrative positions across Canada's most essential industries. The message was clear. Canada didn't just want Filipinos to fill labor gaps. They wanted Filipinos to help run the country. Think about that. Think about what it means for millions of Filipinos abroad. For decades, Filipinos carried global industries on their backs without ever receiving recognition. Now, for the first time, a powerful nation was saying, "Lead with us." This wasn't migration. This was transformation. But that transformation won't reach everyone. Only those who stay informed, stay prepared, and stay ahead of the changes will benefit. Opportunities like these don't wait for anyone. They don't slow down because you were busy. They don't pause because you didn't subscribe. And if you want to rely on luck instead of information, comment that too. Your comment becomes engagement, and your hesitation becomes the reason someone else decides to take control of their future. And here's the most important part. This story isn't finished. Canada's final announcement, the one analysts believe will shift the global migration system permanently, has not yet been revealed. But when it comes, it will determine who thrives and who falls behind. That next chapter is coming soon, and when it arrives, every Filipino must be ready.